Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Open Skies podcast. I am with soon-to-be best-selling author Nate Glover. Nate, welcome to the show, my friend.
Thank you, and thank you for having me on. I mean, I've watched your show over the last couple of weeks and months, and it's been awesome. You know, some of the conversations that you've had, and I'm just happy to be on today.
Well, we go back a couple of years, right to the pandemic. We first met in Calgary when you were here visiting in one of your roles, and I wanted to have you on because you've had such a great career on the ground ops side, which is a bit of the show that we haven't really touched on yet. And then you have a book coming out, and it's a book that covers a pretty exciting yet pretty depressing time in Canada during the pandemic and your career during that time. So thank you for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
So why don't we start with how you got into the airline industry? So why don't you tell me your origin story with airlines?
Yeah, so actually a pretty unique story, and none of my parents are in aviation. I was just an aviation geek from really a young age. I lived in Staten Island, New York, so right on the the arrival path into Newark Airport, watching airplanes go over quite often. But I had an opportunity to actually work in security, and when I was doing security, I was working with a catering company, so we were doing some catering security for a bit, and had an opportunity to get into the airport operations side and really kind of see what they were doing. Got me really interested. I'm like, this could fit right in my wheelhouse. I love talking to people. I love being in those public facing roles, and had an opportunity to actually join Continental back in New Jersey. So I worked in Newark right before the merger with United, but it was an interesting time, and I worked there as a passenger service agent, ramp agent, and ramp lead. Spent about a year there, and then had the opportunity to go down to Orlando and work for JetBlue, which I was at for a while.
So JetBlue was founded by David Neeleman, just one of those iconic, legendary visionaries in our industry. What was that like? Tell me about JetBlue.
JetBlue was an exciting airline, and I was there at a really, really exciting time. We were growing, things were changing. I was there as a passenger service agent, had an opportunity to really kind of go a bit deeper into, my understanding of the aviation industry itself, and then had an opportunity to really move around the business. I worked in several locations in New Jersey and Orlando, and then wound up in Detroit, where I, opened up the station for them as a station manager and spent some time there working with the business partners and learning that side of the business. Was there for quite some time until I had a bit of an opportunity that I wasn't really expecting. I got a call actually through LinkedIn from an individual in Europe, actually out in Norway, and asked me, we have this airline that currently has quite a large operation in Europe, but we're looking to do some low-cost, long-haul flying into the U.S., and that was Norwegian. So,
wow, okay.
Yeah, so it was very interesting. I joined Norwegian early on when they were flying only one flight between London, Gatwick, and JFK, and spent 4 years, 4 very, very exciting years, really.
Right.
Leading the operations in North America and South America, from JFK to 19 cities across both continents, and both sides of the world. And did some work in Europe and some work in the U.S. and that was quite exciting, to be honest. I mean,
No doubt.
Probably where I've learned the most in my career has been with Norwegian.
So you have two different airlines there, right? You got JetBlue, which kind of specialized in that kind of high value but shorter stage length kind of flights, and then you have a ULCC that's flying long haul. What are the big differences? What are the big challenges?
So I think the difference, JetBlue knew their identity. They knew what they were doing, and they were very familiar with the space that they were in. The difference is Norwegian was a European airline.
Yeah.
not a lot of experience in the US. And they were just trying to test the market. Let's see, if this long haul, low cost model actually works. And I think being new to that market, it gave them opportunity to really change the way long haul travel is really looked at. You have the American and the Deltas and British Airways that were charging, X amount of dollars to go across the pond. And you look at today and you see the JetBlues of the world that are now using narrow bodies and going across the pond at lower costs. And that's all comes from what Norwegian did for those 4 years. North Atlantic, that's doing the exact same thing. It comes from, some of the trials, some of the, challenges that they had. JetBlue was able to learn from, Norse was able to learn from. So it's quite unique in that respect.
So what was your biggest takeaway from Norwegian?
My biggest takeaway from Norwegian was the fact that low cost, long haul can work. You just need to know where a market can absorb that type of activity, number one. And then how do you keep the costs low? I think some of the challenges that we face is trying to fly to, larger airports where the cost is going to be much higher, and, didn't really understand that part. But we did some really unique things in flying from smaller airports like Providence. And you see, really across the U.S., these secondary airports are now really coming to light. You see airports that were, just airfields for, private aviation that are now becoming commercial airlines and commercial airports. And really the reason for that is, they saw that it can work. You had a really unknown airport in New York with Stewart International Airport, and it really became an international airport. And they were increasing their revenue, and it was a unique operation for sure, but it can be done.
It's funny that word international sometimes does some heavy lifting up in Canada. So I'm glad to see that it does some heavy lifting down in the States as well.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about, I want to get into the book and I want to get to your time in Canada. So let's start with how you ended up with Menzies and how you ended up in Canada. And then we could get into a little bit about the pandemic and the challenges you faced there. So what was your start there?
Yeah, so absolutely. I wasn't really thinking Menzies, wasn't thinking Canada too much. And I had an individual that I actually worked with when I worked for Norwegian. Menzies did that provided a lot of services for Norwegian, both in the U.S. and in Europe. And I connected with a lot of people, and there was an opportunity that was open for me to be an operational leader for one of the carriers in Toronto. And I thought to myself, I can't turn this down. This is an exciting opportunity to move to a different country and really experience that. And, I actually got ready to go, and then it stalled because I wasn't able to get a work permit for 5 months. So I actually spent 5 months with Menzies in Denver and in Newark, New Jersey, and working in the operations and being a leader in New Jersey as well for some time. And then finally, I got the call in February, I think, of 2019 that said, it's time to go to Canada. Got ready to get on the plane, and my role that I went there for actually changed. So I was no longer looking after just one of the carriers, but looking after the entire country and all of the operations. And I found that out on my first day there. So
okay,
quite exciting.
So 2019 was kind of you look back at the golden year that it was, because that was the year before everything fell apart. What was that first year like up in Canada?
It was interesting. I stepped into, a role where there were some challenges, there were some culture issues, there were some safety issues, some things that I needed to address immediately. And now I'm going into, a new role, new team, didn't know anybody in Canada, had no family in Canada or anything like that.
Right.
But it gave me an opportunity to really build a culture of trust, uh, and really build a relationship with the entire team there in Canada. And I think, as I'll relate it to my book, but as you go through the book, you'll start to understand, how those relationships were extremely impactful. And you've had one of my closest colleagues, James Wong, on just recently, and brilliant mind in aviation in his own right, and really, one of my closest confidants and somebody that I really, trusted as we, worked together through that pandemic. So it was very, very interesting.
So that you said the P word, so we might as well get into it. So you had that year to kind of get acclimatized in Canada, to get your feet wet, to understand the country a bit, to understand an operation, and then almost overnight that operation changes and your support structure changes completely. So talk to me about that process, because I know that put a lot of stress on a lot of people in this industry, and you couldn't have avoided the stress. So tell me about that time and how that went through.
Yeah, I think, to be honest, I was facing, personal stress from it, not being able to go and visit family in the US, but also stress at home. But, my thought process behind it is, the people that are going through this, the people that are serving on the front line, I can't imagine what kind of stress they're going through. Not knowing, if they're going to have a job in the next week or in the next, month, and really having to reduce the workforce by such a significant amount, 80%, 90% was, it was really heart wrenching. But to be honest, I had a team that I knew was moldable, number one, but that I could trust. And it really, gave me an opportunity to start building those relationships. And I say it, you really have to be, able to connect with people on a different level, especially when you're going through something like that, going through the battle, we're going through a massive crisis. Everyone is affected. And I had a team that really came together and was really there to push forward. I mean, I can go back to, a story, and it's in the book, where I talk about, having to unfortunately lay off about 550 people.
Wow.
And, we had reduced in the office to about 6 or 7 people. But every single person that was on my team went, and we personally met with every single person. We did that personal touch, and it was really, connecting with those employees on a different level. You have to be able to, understand that they're going through just as much or even more stress than I was going through. I came to work with a brave face, regardless of what was happening in my life. It was affecting several hundred people. And I was now the person that was in charge of making sure that they were well taken care of. They had direction, they knew what they were doing, and I given them as much information as I can.
So just having to have those face-to-face conversations must have been heart-wrenching. 550 Absolutely. People. And, I got to know a lot of people who did work for Menzies, and I know the culture you guys built there was very strong. So that must have been very difficult.
Yes, it was. I wouldn't put it on anyone ever. I mean, some of the stories that, were told to me, and, the conversations that I had, you take that stuff back, you absorb all of that. And it really, stuck with me throughout my entire time there. But it gave me a very, very close connection to all of the staff, being able to, see them on the other end when things started to ramp up again, and bringing them back in, and, being able to really relate to them.
Right. So walk me through the timeline of the pandemic from your point of view. When did you first know that this was going to be an issue that was going to dramatically affect your operations? I know it happened so quickly that we went, like in my previous job at WestJet, we went from a full service airline to almost 10% of what we used to be in a 3-week span. So what was it like for you? And when did you first know that this was not just going to be an IROP, but this was going to be a situation that was going to change everything?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in late February, there was some, the news, increasing news stories about this virus, and, people not recovering, and I started to get worried. Started to think to myself like, oh, this is quite odd. Hearing about this virus every single day. But then one of the airlines decided to cancel their entire schedule for one day. And that's what it really was. Okay, one day we're going to cancel our entire schedule, and I would have to send people home. But shortly after, you could see that people weren't traveling. I remember walking into the airport about the last week of February, early first week of March, and there was nobody. I mean, and I thought to myself,
in Toronto.
Yeah, in Toronto. So in an airport where there's thousands of people moving about all the time, it took me 15 minutes to get to work, which normally takes me 45 minutes to get to work. And I walked into the airport and I saw maybe 50 people. And at that point I said, we have a problem.
We have a problem.
We have a problem. And this is not good.
So staffing for ground handling works a bit different, right? So airlines give you the schedule in advance, and then it's your job to staff those flights and to make sure you have the ability to turn those aircraft. When airlines started to cancel flights so close in, what did that do to the operation?
So in terms of the operation, I mean, it really crippled us for quite some time in terms of revenue. The airlines work very differently from ground handling. When you're in ground handling, there's a lot of fixed costs. There's a lot of other aspects that cost quite a bit of money, and you need to be able to pay for that. And the issue is, we were now 85% less flight volume, which meant that we needed to match that on the staffing side. And having to even have those conversations was quite difficult. There's labor unions, there's other things that are involved, and really had to dig deep into the toolbox to have some tough conversations with the labor unions, and there was no playbook for this. There was no manual, something that you could refer to, or somebody could go ask and say, how do I reduce my head count from 800 to 150 in 3 days.
That's a staggering task.
Yes.
So you mentioned the labor union part. Talk to me a little bit about that, because that is a unique challenge as well. Being locked into a collective bargaining agreement. Would this be a force majeure kind of situation, or were the labor unions understanding that this is not a normal everyday dispute? Like, it's not a typical labor problem.
No, absolutely. I think, I had to do some or provide some education to the labor unions, because, often when labor unions look at aviation, they look at it as a whole. Airlines have big profit, big revenue. And I really had to break it down to the labor unions and say, here's what we're going through, and this is where we need to get to make sure that we can come out on the other side of this. And it was really about having some really tough conversations with the leads in the labor union to say, I understand we both have the same interests. We want to protect the staff. We want to make sure that they're well taken care of. But this is how we need to do it. We have to make these decisions because we want to make sure that we're sustainable. And early on in the beginning, there was no indication that this was going to last, several years. Yeah. So, it was a bit easier, having a conversation and say, okay, I need to, lay off X amount of people for 2 weeks. And then after that 2 weeks, having to go back and say, well, this could be a year. This could be 2 years.
Right.
Nobody knows.
And the whole viability of the operation in Canada must have been at risk if you couldn't get those concessions.
Absolutely. And I think if we couldn't get those concessions, we would have ran into some significant challenges.
Yeah.
And I spent 1 week with the, head of the labor union every single day in the office, kind of trying to educate him on, how the ground handling business ran and what it is that we were going to do. And, I dug quite deep into the toolbox in terms of, how could we protect as many staff as we possibly could without, collapsing the business. And it was a balance that was, challenging. But again, and I go back to the people that, I led beside, people like James Long and other individuals that I worked alongside, and going to them for, their opinion. How do we do this? It's not a decision that, I think I could have instantly just made on my own, because every single person brought something different to the table, whether
Right.
it was, their communication skills, technical operations, whatever the case was, and the human aspect in having those conversations. I never, shut the labor union out and said, this is what I'm doing and this is how I'm going to do it, because I knew that approach wouldn't work. You had to build that relationship and really, ensure that they were going to be successful on the other end, just as we wanted to be successful on the other end.
Now, and that's the partnership with the labor unions. One other thing I wanted to touch on, eh, because I'm sure this was a fascinating discussion. So while you're having the staffing discussions, airlines are changing their demands on you on almost a daily basis. Like I know airlines were trying to ramp back up to profitability, and then Omicron hits, and then we ramp back down. And like the changing demands on you guys must have been almost overwhelming. How was the communication with the airlines, and what kind of changes were happening in real time during that time?
I think in the beginning, the airlines were not necessarily understanding of the ground handling situation, how we operate. Again, that went back to educating some individuals in the airlines to really understanding how things work.
Right.
And some of the changes that were happening, they were rapid. We would go from providing one or two different types of services to now needing to provide 6 or 7 different types of services, because the airlines were looking to reduce their costs, and then transfer it over to a ground handling company, which we would then have to ramp up and start hiring people and putting people back into places and training and so on and so forth. And it was a opportunity where we had to be flexible. There was nothing that we were not willing to do. And all of my managers, directors were all trained on all aspects of the operation, because, like you said, it could change day to day. We would, have no flights, and then the next day there would be charters. I can't call people off of, furlough and bring them back and say, oh, can you work one flight? So they had all of the directors, myself, out there working flights as well.
Yeah, throwing bags, getting your knees in the pit.
Oh, yeah. Definitely.
Well, that's always the fun part, eh?
Yeah, it was fun, 10 years ago, but not necessarily fun at that point.
So, and then there's another side to this too, where, you had to downsize so dramatically quickly. But then there was a big shift in Canada. Airlines stopped using their own employees and started really outsourcing work to ground handlers and ground handling companies and other service providers, third-party companies, if you will. So on the other end of the pandemic, what was the ramp up like to get all these extra services added back?
Yeah, I think, as terrible as the pandemic was, it gave us an opportunity to really grow the business. And really start to intertwine our operation and understanding of the business with the airlines.
Right.
And we really utilized that to grow quite successfully during the pandemic and put a lot of people back into the workplace that weren't necessarily there. I think, there certainly was challenges with, really communicating with the airlines on a regular basis, but having them understand how we do the business. But it got to a point where the airlines understood that they needed to rely on the ground handlers' expertise. We had the ability to provide a service, a quality service, safe service, and do it efficiently and at a lower cost than they had. And I think it was a reality check for some of the carriers to say, maybe there's an opportunity for us to take this, variable cost and turn it into a fixed cost.
And your headcount, you said you had to lay off 550 staff at the start of the pandemic. What was your lowest headcount and what was it when you left?
Our lowest headcount was 78. 78 employees
Wow.
was the lowest headcount.
Oh,
And then right before I left, it was about 400.
wow. So 78 people to run a whole country worth of operations.
Yes, it was. It was very interesting. I think everybody, put on different hats and did a little bit of everything. I remember some of our recruiters, training to become ramp agents or passenger service agents, and you know, doing a little bit of everything. And to be honest, it was exciting. It was a sad time, but a lot of individuals gained so much experience during the pandemic, and it's really, really helped them in excelling their own careers. Because
Yeah.
oftentimes in ground handling, even in the airline side of the business, there's several silos. HR doesn't talk to operations doesn't talk to finance, and really my goal was let's be collaborative. We're all in this together. We're gonna.
And there's no help coming.
There's no help coming. Yeah, no help coming. You can't get on a plane and have somebody come in. And we did some really unique things. I mean, I remember opening up a station. I believe it was up in Halifax or somewhere close to that, where all of the training was provided virtually until the day of operation.
Wow.
And if you've ever been on the ramp, it's quite startling when the first time you're standing in front of an aircraft and marching it in. This is the first time you're actually seeing a live aircraft. So there were some unique challenges, but we found some ways to get around it. How do we provided passenger handling training virtually for several months, never even seen the employees. And the first day we're there, we had one person there that would help them with the operation, and that was it.
Wow.
So, I mean, you really had to be able to kind of pivot at a moment's notice and adapt to, the situation at hand.
And just find ways to be innovative and find ways to do new things.
Absolutely.
That brings me to the book, Trust the Process. So, what inspired you to write a book? You were off camera. You were telling me you took detailed notes in Canada. So you must have had some idea that you were going through something historic when you were in that moment. So walk me through the process of writing a book, and then we're going to get into a little bit of what the first book's going to cover.
Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, I think what really, really drove me to write a book is, I've had a lot of challenges through my career, and I've had a lot of great leaders, and I've done a lot of fun projects, and I like to share my knowledge with everybody that I come in contact with. But going through the pandemic, I really knew that this was going to be a pivotal time, or a tumultuous, a time in aviation that we would never forget.
Yeah.
And I knew that it was incumbent upon me to, document what exactly I was going through. Did I think I was going to turn it into a book? No, I just thought maybe, I'd be able to reference back to it and go and, and see things. But, I had a direct report that really inspired me to write it. And this individual was going through some challenges in their career and trying to find the next opportunity. And, and I spent about 2 hours on the phone talking through the things that we worked together on during the pandemic. And I said to myself, these challenges relate to so many people. There's people that have gone through this that are not in aviation.
Right.
The way my thought process behind it and how I made some of these tough decisions, it needs to be shared. It needs to be shared. It's not something that I want to, keep inside. And, I had opportunities to work, even with Menzies outside of Canada after that, and in Los Angeles. And, I shared a lot of the knowledge that I gained from the pandemic. I used when I got to LA. And I thought, right, there's people out there that, are going through crisis, not necessarily a pandemic, but crisis on a regular basis. And they're trying to figure out, how do we make these changes? I mean, you look at some airlines now that are going through, bankruptcy and, loss of revenue, and they're going to have to make some of those some of those challenging decisions as well. How do we right size the business and make sure that, we can be successful on the other side? And I think there's some really unique, tips and thoughts on how I made some of those decisions.
So the title, Trust the Process. Tell me why you landed on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a saying that I've used, and anybody that I work with can tell you that's the one thing that I always go back to. I think, if you have a plan in place and, you are moving in the right direction and you're pushing it forward, you have to stay the course. You have to trust the process. You have to trust that what you've put on paper, what you've set out to do is going to work. And I think, oftentimes we start to veer off and try to, change how we do things. I mean, growing in a pandemic was crazy. And who would have thought, you want to ask for investment to, grow a business when we don't even know what's going to happen tomorrow. But part of my, plan, and it talks about it in the book, was we were going to grow this business. We were going to employ more people. We were going to, touch more communities, bring, employees into the aviation industry, and we had to stay the course. Even though things had changed, there was a plan in place that we had to move forward with. We were changing the culture and creating a safer environment. If we would have, went a different direction or left one of those steps out, we could have wound up in some really significant trouble. But we were able to do that because, we stayed the course.
Now, you hit on a word I want to talk about is safety. At that time, I can think of friends of mine that were pilots and flight attendants that were very concerned about safety at that time. And of course, people were getting sick left, right, and center. How did you look after your staff in such a crazy environment? How did you keep them safe?
Yeah, the first thing that we did is, masks were a requirement. And, we did not hesitate to provide masks to, every single employee when the pandemic hit. But even when it came to testing, I remember partnering with, the government there and getting, free COVID tests. And, we opened it up for anyone and everyone to take a COVID test. If they wanted to have it, if they needed one or two to bring home to, make sure that their family was okay, we did it, and we, expanded our break rooms to make sure that, people could keep the social distancing, and really made it where, it was okay if people didn't feel comfortable, if they were, scared of something, or they weren't necessarily sure if they had been exposed. We gave them an open forum to speak up and have those conversations. We set up a, specific, email address where people could address their safety concerns and what it is that they were, concerned about. But then, on the outside of the pandemic itself, on the operations side, we had a unique opportunity to kind of reset in terms of safety on the operational side.
Yeah.
And we took a back to basics approach. It's like, let's go back to how, training is done, from the T. And that was some of the small things, you're in the operation and you're moving at 1,000 miles an hour and trying to get an aircraft out, and people miss steps. And this was an opportunity for us to slow down and say, these 50 people or 40 people that are going to be on the ramp, we're going to make sure we're doing everything step by step. And then as people come back into the workplace, we're going to drive that in through them. And that, the pandemic did give us that opportunity, because as we scaled up, it wasn't all at once. So we had an opportunity to bring people in and almost, reignite their interest in aviation and reset the safety culture.
Yeah, that was one of the opportunities we identified before all the mass layoffs happened, is that as we slowed down as an airline, there would be an incredible opportunity to actually fix some of the processes that you knew were broken, but when you're running a 200 flight a day operation or that kind of thing, that it's almost impossible to stop, fix, and then restart. So it's interesting that you hit on that. Is there any processes that come to mind that you were able to kind of reorganize and do differently with the slowdown, or?
I think in terms of processes, training itself was a process that we're trying to push out, 40 or 50 employees a week. Are we really spending enough time on training? I mean, we sat down and really reinvented the training process.
Yeah.
How are we going to connect directly with people? How are we, we didn't think about, should people, be asking questions, or should we be doing different things to keep people engaged? When we're, at, 100 flights a day, we're looking to just get people out of the classroom and out into the operation. We had an opportunity to not have to do that, and to say, okay, we want to make sure that you engage and you actually enjoy what it is that you're doing. Because anybody that's out there that's not paying attention, that's the easiest way for somebody to get hurt. This is, I tell people all the time, I said, I liken it to organized chaos out there in the operation. One misstep could be horrific.
Well, I remember coming to a company that I was working for after WestJet, and they had asked me what goes into turning a 737. And I kind of looked blankly at first, because I'm like, that's a pretty heavy question.
Yeah.
So for our listeners who don't know what turning an aircraft is like, can you give me some idea of all of those steps that go through getting a plane out safely? Like high level, don't go through all of them.
Yeah,
but just for our listeners who aren't ground handling specific, what's it look like?
Yeah, I think, as a passenger, you never see some of the inner workings of an operation. You don't realize that, before the aircraft even arrives, there's steps that need to be done. You're on a tarmac where there's stuff blowing around, all the time. There's a safety sweep that goes on even prior to the aircraft arriving, and then being there to guide the aircraft in and, bring several pieces of heavy equipment up to the aircraft to offload the bags, and
without damaging the aircraft.
Without damaging the aircraft, exactly. And, quite challenging to do when there's snow and ice on the tarmac, and, you're trying to maneuver around that. But really taking all those bags off the aircraft and making sure they get to the right destination, reading the tags, and then getting the rest of the bags that need to go out and putting them back up. Now, mind you, all this is happening in a 30-minute window. So
right.
It seems like there's a lot of time, but I remember loading, more than 200 bags on a 737 with 3 people. So
right.
If you think about, that's 200 and something bags going up, 200 and something bags that have already come off. Somebody is driving them to a belt to drop them off, to get them back to the passengers. There's laboratory service that needs to be done, water service that needs to be done. Even before the aircraft is ready to go,
ground
safety
power,
checks and ground
preconditioned air.
Yeah, everything. I mean, if there's one hiccup, you could, be there and have an air start and have to, put compressed air into the aircraft so you can start an engine at the gate and then push the aircraft out and, see it off. It's a lot of things happen, a lot of work that's going into that turn process in a short amount of time, let alone having passengers come off the aircraft, putting passengers on the aircraft. If there's any, special situations, wheelchair passengers that need help coming on and off the aircraft, cleaning the aircraft, and then, seeing it off and doing it again 20 minutes later.
On a different gate on the other end of the airport.
Exactly. So moving all that equipment, for 10 minutes and driving across, a ramp when it's freezing cold in Toronto.
Well, Nate, you've had a fascinating career, seeing all sides of the operation at the airport. I guess we've only got a couple of minutes left, so I just want your opinion on where you think the industry is going. We talk a lot on this podcast about the Canadian marketplace, but there's some fascinating stuff going on down south with consolidation, with bankruptcies, with business models changing, like people who have been core ULCCs, adding services. You have formerly all first class adding ULCC-like products. Where do you see the industry going in the next couple of years in the States?
Yeah, I think consolidation is going to continue. There's, airlines that are struggling. There's, airlines that are looking, to figure out what their next step is, and, consolidation is going to continue. But, it's very unique in the sense that we've kind of switched, back to, several decades ago when, every airline is looking to provide a first class product. And I think in some cases that's a misstep. I think focus on what you're good at. This pent up travel demand is not going to last forever. And I think we're looking at the right now, airlines are looking at the right now and what's going to bring, the increased revenue in the short term. But what's going to happen in the 2 to 3 years as the demand starts to dry up, and individuals are no longer looking for comfort in trying to get to, on an hour and a half flight. They're looking for, what can I pay? How much is it going to be for me to go there? I'm not taking a bag, so I just want a seat, and I just want to get to my destination in an hour and a half. I don't care about a first class seat. And then you're going to have, I think, over the next several years, you're going to have airlines that are ripping first class out again and increasing the, density. The coach class, and increasing, economy seats, and starting again to deconstruct the pricing in terms of, ticket prices. But, I think it's going to change, and we're going to go through this continuous cycle. But the airlines that are continuing to focus on what they're good at is, I see them really achieving great success. I look at Alaska and, their merger with Hawaiian, which has been, quite eye-opening, but they're focusing on what they're good at. That little market over there in the West Coast, their Seattle hub, that's huge. That's where they bring their travels to. They know that people are loyal to Alaska, and they're really tapping into their loyal customers. And really what they did is they brought a product that was needed. There was little optionality, out of Seattle. I see they're going to Asia and places like that.
I saw that announcement this week.
Yeah. So a little optionality, and Alaska is saying, we know you, our loyal customer, wants to travel to Tokyo. So do it on us from Seattle. Don't go ahead and spend, extra amount of money, going on a different carrier. So I think they're actually on the right track, and I think they're going to be quite successful over the next several years.
Well, I look forward to having you back on to see if that prediction comes true. Before we leave, I want to give you a chance to one more time promote the book. Tell me where I can find it. Tell me where it's coming out, and let us know how to support you.
Yeah, absolutely. So Trust the Process, Navigating Leadership Through the Pandemic, is coming out January 26th. Written by me. It's the first book to a 4-part series. So there's going to be some other books that really start to deep into some other areas during the pandemic. But this is just a journey. And, I'm excited to even be able to share my story and take people on that journey over those 2.5 years, and hopefully provide some guidance to young leaders, and some tips and tricks and some thought processes for any leaders out there in any industry.
Excellent. And where can we find the book?
And it'll be available on all platforms. So Amazon, Audible, everywhere, Barnes and Nobles, Borders, wherever you can find books, it will be available.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Nate. I really appreciate the time you spent with us today.
Thank you, Chris. Take care.
And thank you for spending some time with us on the Open Skies podcast. We're going to be back with some great episodes coming up in the new year. Thank you so much.